Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Kendra, and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you the knitting tools and notions that I have purchased that I don't use. So I've been knitting for about 4 years now. It'll be 4 years in October. And over these 4 years, I have purchased some tools that I thought would be total game changers and ended up being completely obsolete for my knitting purposes. And I have my tried and true tools and notions that I use all of the time. And if you're interested in hearing more about those, I can make a separate video. But today I'm just wanting to share the flops, the things that I purchased that for one reason or another, I no longer use. While I chat about that, I'm going to be getting some progress on my muscle burr hat that I'm knitting for my husband. I am a good amount of the way through, but I still feel like I have quite a bit left to knit. A few more inches, maybe a couple more inches before I can start the crown decreases. Let's start with knitting needles. So I purchased a set of bamboo double pointed needles from Amazon because I wanted to get into knitting socks, and I didn't think that the interchangeable needles that I had at the time would help me knit socks. Within that set, I would have what I need to successfully knit socks, and I was not wrong. I did use those needles to knit one sock with some worsted weight acrylic from my stash, but I never knit the second sock, and I didn't enjoy the knitting experience because the wood or bamboo, I don't know if it was wood or bamboo, but let's just say wood for simplicity's sake, that material combined with the yarn was not, it wasn't it. It made my teeth itch. I did not like the sensation. And that experience made me realize that wooden or bamboo needles just were not for me, and that metal needles were just made for a more comfortable knitting experience. I didn't totally write off double pointed needles, but wooden needles off the table completely after that experience. They were also, I think, 3 inches long. And for double pointed needles, that is quite short. Doesn't give you a lot of options on the types of things that you can knit with those needles. So I was pretty much restricted to socks and other pieces that were of a similar circumference. So maybe some mittens or things like that, but I couldn't necessarily knit sleeves with them because they were too short. So there were limitations in that regard too. And I just don't use them anymore because after that first project, I found them completely obsolete for my purposes. I guess the one good thing is that I didn't spend a lot of money on them. So I want to say they were less than $20. What else? In terms of knitting needles, I have a set of Knitter's Pride double pointed needles as well that I also don't use. These, I want to say, are 6 inches long, and in that regard, they are a lot more practical than the first double pointed needles that I purchased. And the size range is not as comprehensive, so they're intended for sock knitting. And I primarily use them to knit the heel flap and turn on my socks in combination with my 9-inch circulars, which I'll talk about in a minute. So they were useful for knitting the toes and the heels of my socks where the 9-inch circulars didn't exactly cut it. And I have knit a few socks with those needles from start to finish, so they were perfect for that as well. But I don't use them anymore because I no longer knit socks or 9-inch circulars. I knit magic loop socks, and I can knit the entire sock from start to finish or magic loop without having to switch to a different type of needle to do the heel and the toe. And for that reason, these needles have become obsolete and I no longer use them. I have listed them in this private group I'm in to sell them, and nobody has expressed interest. So until I can get them off my hands, they will stay in my collection. But yeah, if any of you are interested in purchasing them and taking them off my hands, feel free to send me an email or a DM over on Instagram. I will be happy to work with you on that. They serve their purpose very well. Unlike the first double pointed needles, they actually did come in good use for me for a time. But again, things have changed. I knit my socks differently now, and so they're just not useful any longer, but they're a really great set of needles and I would recommend them. And yeah, that's that. The other needles that I don't use are my 9-inch circular needles. So when I first got into knitting socks and I bought the wooden double pointed needles that I realized I didn't enjoy using, my next sort of sock knitting needle purchase were my 9-inch circulars. So I bought a pair of ChiaoGoo 9-inch circulars, and that served me really well. I loved using the 9-inch circulars over double pointed needles. I figured it was the lesser of two evils, but looking back, it still wasn't my favorite knitting experience. So with the 9-inch circulars, you kind of have to scrunch your hands up really small, and I found it very fatiguing for my hands. But I endured with the 9-inch circulars for quite some time, maybe a couple of years, before I purchased a set of longer ChiaoGoo needles that I could knit socks with magic loop. And the only reason I even purchased the longer sock needles is because I changed my knitting style. So as you can see, I am flicking. So my yarn is in my right hand. I'm not taking my hand off to complete a stitch. Before I knit this way, I would throw. So both are English style knitting, but it's a different version of English style knitting. So before, I would have it between my thumb and my index finger, and I would wrap the yarn around here. I would grab the needle, push the stitch through, and a very cumbersome process, not nearly as quick as I knit now. So once I switched my knitting style from throwing to flicking, which is what I do now, I tension my yarn differently. I hold my needles differently. I hold my needles like towards the base of the needle, so I'm not gripping as close to the front. And with the 9-inch circulars, the actual needles themselves were so short that I couldn't hold it the same way, hold it in my new preferred way of knitting. So I couldn't really use them anymore. I would have to go back to throwing and scrunching my hands up, and I just wasn't interested in doing that. So I purchased the longer sock needles to do magic loop, and I've been doing that ever since. And that's my preferred way of knitting socks. So all of my other sock knitting methods, the double pointed needles and the 9-inch circulars, I don't use them anymore, but they were perfect when I did need them. I just don't anymore, and that's fine. And in a similar vein to the 9-inch circulars, at one point I did purchase the ChiaoGoo interchangeable set, the tiny, like the shorter circumference version in the blue case. I don't remember what the technical name is, but basically you can make 9-inch circular circumference, and I think larger circumference. So they had a really tiny short needle and then a relatively longer needle. I purchased them to be able to knit sleeves because I wasn't interested at the time in magic loop. But shortly after that, again, I changed my knitting style and I became a huge fan of magic loop, and those two became obsolete. I was able to sell those, so I don't have them anymore, but yeah, that's another thing that I purchased that I don't use anymore. And in terms of knitting needles, I have a couple of more. So the first ever interchangeable needle set that I purchased was a Knit Picks, the nickel plated interchangeable set. I do not remember what the actual name is. Those were the first knitting needles I ever purchased. I'd never knit a stitch before, and that was the first one I purchased. It was a pretty good price point, if I recall correctly, like less than $50. And my logic was that, like, I'm not a knitter yet. This isn't a legit hobby for me. And I don't know what I'm going to enjoy knitting. And I don't want to buy a fixed set of needles to, say, knit a hat. And I hate knitting hats. And then that's really all that this needle can do for me. To me, it just made more sense to jump in with an interchangeable set so that I can knit any type of project I might want, as I was figuring out what I liked and what I didn't like, what I liked to knit, and etc. So I have no regrets on purchasing that interchangeable set. However, after a few months of knitting, I quickly realized that this was a hobby that would stick around. And so I no longer felt precious about investing in something a little bit nicer. So I eventually replaced that set with a set of ChiaoGoo red lace interchangeables that I do use religiously. Like, it's that those aren't necessarily on this list, but I will touch on that next. So yeah, the Knit Picks needles became obsolete, and I just didn't use them anymore because I found a better replacement. But for a first set of interchangeable needles, they worked perfectly. I have no complaints. It's just, again, not the nicest. And I don't want to be a needle snob, but the main thing that I didn't love about those needles was the cord. So ChiaoGoo's cords, in my experience, are just unmatched. Granted, I haven't knit with all of the interchangeable sets out there. I only have knitting experience with the ChiaoGoos and then the Knit Picks needles, but between those two, the ChiaoGoo cords are just way better. They don't kink up, they don't coil and wrap around themselves. Much more pleasant knitting experience. And that was one thing that always annoyed me about the Knit Picks set. But I still keep the Knit Picks set around, although they are not what I use for my primary knitting. They do come in handy if I need an extra set of cords or to be able to put some stitches on hold and I don't want to use scrap yarn. I can use the cords and needles from that set to sort of supplement what I have with my ChiaoGoo sets. So they do still come in handy. I just don't use them for knitting anymore. Last but not least are my ChiaoGoo interchangeable sets. So I mentioned that I love my ChiaoGoos. No complaints there. They, as a whole, are not obsolete, but half of the needle sizes have proven to be useless for me because I don't use them. So so there's a story here, but I'm going to try to keep it short. After I was using my Knit Picks for some time and I decided that knitting was a hobby that would stick around and I was just in it for the long haul, I invested in my first set of ChiaoGoo interchangeable needles. Yes, there's more than one. I will explain. And when I purchased them, I was surprised and slightly disappointed that they were not what I was expecting. What I didn't realize at the time is that you can buy them in different lengths. And I don't know if all needle manufacturers offer both 4-inch tips and 5-inch tips, but ChiaoGoo offers 4-inch and 5-inch. And I didn't realize that I had, to that point, learned knitting and got really used to using 5-inch tips instead of 4-inch tips. And when I purchased my ChiaoGoos, I assumed they would be comparable in the sort of size and feel of my Knit Picks needles. And I didn't realize that I was purchasing a 4-inch set, which was an inch shorter than my 5-inch set. And they were certainly usable. I stuck it out and I persevered. For one, because I didn't know 5-inch was an option. And for two, I just figured I would just get used to it. My hands would get used to using the 4-inch needles and I would be fine. And a few months after that, I purchased another set of ChiaoGoos, my 5 inches. And those are the ones I use the most. And I love them. But the thing is, I still use my 4 inches, right? I use them. They're perfect to make a 16-inch circumference, which is ideal for knitting hats. So I'm using my 4-inch needle tips in this project. And they're also perfect for knitting collars, which most of the garments I knit have some type of collar where I need to pick up stitches or cast on at the neck. And the 16-inch circumference is perfect for that. Everything else pretty much, if I'm knitting the body of a sweater or if I'm knitting magic loop on a sleeve, I'm going to be using my 5-inch tips. But in any given sweater project, I'm bound to use both my 4-inch tips and my 5-inch tips. So both sets are useful to me. What is not useful about them is the larger needle sizes. So ChiaoGoo interchangeables come in a small size range and a large size range, and the large needles fit with the large cord connectors and all that, and the small, etc. Over the past few years of owning those sets, I never ever use above a 5mm. I may use a 5.5, not often. I'm not one to knit bulky weight projects. I don't enjoy knitting them. I don't enjoy wearing them. So it's just not something that's really in my project rotation very often. And yeah, I've just found that I never use the large range of sizes in my ChiaoGoo interchangeable sets. And the crazy thing is they sell it with the small size range only. So if I could turn back the hands of time, I would have purchased my ChiaoGoo interchangeables, both the 4-inch and the 5-inch, but I would only purchase the small size range instead of purchasing the full size range that includes the small and the large needle tips. And you know, that wasn't a cheap mistake to make. And yeah, I guess on the bright side of that, I have what I need to knit quite possibly any project I can imagine. And it feels good. Like I can knit us through an apocalypse. I have the tools, trust me. So yeah, I think that covers all of the knitting tools and notions that I have purchased over the past 4 years that I don't really use. And if you've noticed a common theme, it's really that I buy things with the best intentions and I later realized that it's not for me. And that's okay. It's a learning process. It's a journey, but maybe, and a lot of it has to come from trial and error. So I would never have known that I didn't enjoy using double pointed needles or 9-inch circulars if I didn't use double pointed needles and 9-inch circulars to be able to develop that opinion from experience. So I don't regret any of these purchases. And if anything, I'm glad I kept them more on the cheap side, except for the ChiaoGoo interchangeable sets, which could run you like $200 each. And for every knitting tool and notion that I don't use, I have one or more that I use religiously. So I feel like I have really found my groove when it comes to my knitting practice. I've pretty much developed my opinions on what I like and what I don't like, and what I enjoy and what I don't enjoy. And something about that makes me really excited because I approach my knitting with a lot more confidence and self-assuredness that I didn't have at the beginning of my journey. And really that just comes from experience. And I would encourage you not to shy away from trying new things with your knitting and really figuring out what makes the most sense for you. Sometimes that means purchasing something that you may not be using long term. But if that is a true concern for you, you might want to consider borrowing from knitting friends, reaching out to your local knitting guilds to see if they have any tools and notions that they can lend to you, or just doing your research and figuring out from other people's accounts what does and does not work for them. And that can help inform your decisions on the knitting tools and notions that you purchase along your journey. But yeah, if this was helpful or interesting at all, let me know in the comments. And if you want me to come back and do a similar video for the knitting tools and notions that I use all the time, I am happy to share that. I will probably make that video if you tell me you want it or not. So yeah, stay tuned for that. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.